So the title of this session is Research Gaps and Opportunities, a summary, or to paraphrase one of my favorite aging songwriters who is still very prolific. In fact, just released a new album from one of his early albums. This is the Bringing It All Back Home session, if you guys know who that is. So, in any event, we have three summary speakers, and we'll start with Margie Lachman, who has not presented earlier today. She is the Fireman Professor of Psychology and Director of the Lifespan Development Psychology Lab at Brandeis University. And her areas of research focus on the area of lifespan development with a focus on mid and late life. So, Margie?
So thank you so much for inviting me to this very exciting and stimulating conference. I have about 10 minutes to summarize this amazing set of presentations and discussions that we've had today, and I will do my best to stick to the time. What I feel like doing is singing and dancing, but I won't do that. And all of you, I admire you for staying so late because what we all really feel like doing is getting up and doing something after this wonderful discussion. And what I think I take away, just 2 points, is that we all want to go out and do something related to art, and the earlier the better, but hopefully it's never too late. This is an overview of the points that I'd like to discuss today. First, linking, in general, behaviors to healthy aging. Possible mechanisms for linking art and health. When we talk about designs, and this is one of the issues that was raised many times, is what design should we use? It depends on the question. And then I think as we talk about aging and art, we need to think about adapting, and art is very flexible, so that's the good news. And then a little bit about the future, prospect and promise for art and older adults. So first, linking behaviors to healthy aging. A lot of work has been done that shows associations between performance, cognitive performance, happiness, and lots of different behaviors. But very little has been done to look at changes. What can we do to slow aging or minimize declines or enhance quality of life? And it turns out that art is not alone in this regard. There's a lot of observational anecdotal information in many domains where we talk about associations with performance or even try to look at changes are not really done very well. So we don't really have conclusive evidence. It's not just in the art domain. So education is something we talk about is associated with longevity and decrease in risk for dementia and so on, but we don't really know what the mechanisms are. Cognitive stimulation has come up many times. We all know about the crossword puzzle dilemma. Many people ask me, should I do crossword puzzles? We really don't know. Brain games, we've talked a little bit about today. In physical activity, we do know, thanks to some of the work by Kramer and others, that it is good for you, but we really don't know much about what intensity, for how long, how frequently should we be doing this exercise. And then we know about social engagement is good for you. We know that loneliness is bad for you, but we really don't understand how social support or social relationships really do affect, if they do, changes associated with aging. So, but in thinking about this conference today, one of the big things we talked about is what are some of the possible mechanisms. And I can't go into all of them, and this is just a set of possibilities that are more behavioral. But think about art in many ways is a conduit, or it may be the means by which we engage in physical activity. Take dance, for example, or even just going to some sort of a program. Art involves cognitive activity. It involves education, social activity, sensory stimulation. It may give you purpose and meaning in life. It may give you a sense of mastery and control. It may reduce stress. It may give you a sense of generativity or passing on things to the next generation. So these are some of the possible links. And art, in a way, does so many different things. It's kind of this conduit or this mechanism. We now could talk about many of the other links here. So why is it that physical activity affects health? We may think about things like brain function or plasticity and so on. So this is not a direct link. There's going to be other ways through the pathways that could link to health. So now let's come to the kinds of questions that we might ask and what are the different designs that we might use to do that. We've talked mainly about experimental designs and the sort of gold standard of randomized controlled trials and interventions. Yes, those are very desirable, but there are other ones as well. There's developmental and quasi-experimental designs, and there's also within-person designs, daily diary designs, or experience sampling. I'd like to just say a few things about each of these and some of the kinds of questions that we could answer if we move forward in this way. So for experimental designs, some of the questions that people have suggested and some preliminary studies have addressed: is art more effective than other behaviors or treatments? So comparing art to some other intervention. What is it about art that is effective? This, we can vary the different conditions or use different control groups. Maybe we want to look at art alone versus in groups. Participation versus observation, in light of the last presentation. Moderate physical activity versus light physical activity. We could begin to look at mechanisms. We mentioned choice, actually, in the last set of presentations, versus assignment. If we assign people to art, it may not be something they really want to do or like. So to what extent can we give somebody a choice in which program they want? And then we might be able to do a yoke design, where for every choice that's made, we do randomly assign somebody to that same condition. Maintenance and transfer become very, very important for all the studies that we do. To what extent is this going to last and have an effect on many different domains in life? Who participates in this research? So the selection not only has issues in terms of threats to the internal validity of the design, but also in terms of the applicability. And person by treatment effects, we must look at those as well. Who benefits the most from which programs? Not all programs are designed for all people. Not everybody is going to benefit in the same way. So this is your typical RCT design. I won't spend time on it because we're all familiar with it. It's come up many times today. Developmental and quasi-experimental designs. We might look at long-term effects of art, or longitudinally or retrospectively. The kind of work presented earlier by Krauss, for example, looked at some of the long-term effects of music training. Does art affect the aging process? Does it reduce or slow declines? If we follow people over the time for the long haul, we may be able to get information about that. And we don't have to start new longitudinal studies. To the extent that there are existing longitudinal studies that have this kind of information already, we may be able to glean that from those studies. Is art better for older than younger adults? We could look at cross-sectional or longitudinal studies to see to what extent, what's the timing and sequencing of art training? Does it have a different impact at age 20 than it does at age 40? And then look at individual differences in preferences and benefits. Personality may play a role. Culture may play a role. These are some of the variations that we would like to look at. And so here I'm illustrating a longitudinal design where you follow the same people, in this case from age 10 to age 70, and compare those who engage in art with those who don't over time, for example. We see on the right here one of the prolific long-term painters, Rembrandt, painted self-portraits from early on until the end of his life. Cross-sectional design, we can look, as I said, different ages and different subgroups at one point in time to compare to what extent we find that art perhaps has a positive effect. Another design that hasn't come up today is the ABAB reversal design, which is a within group or within person design. It's not a randomized control design, but when you look to see if you give some sort of an art treatment, does it make a difference? And then you can take it away and see what happens when the effects are removed, and then you can bring it back again. It's illustrated here. So you have a baseline, you give a treatment, take it away, reverse it, see if you can extinguish it, and then bring it back and follow on and on to see to what extent the presence or absence of the treatment has an impact within a group or within a person. This has not come up at all today. Daily diaries and experience sampling is another really interesting approach for us to look at the effects of art. First of all, this is typically done in natural settings, not necessarily in the lab, and certainly not only in retirement communities and so on, but it could even be done in the home. It's a within-person design. It looks within the person. The person serves as their own control, if you will. On days when you're doing art, are you happier, for example? At times of the day when you're doing art, are you better off in terms of your blood pressure, your heart rate, your cortisol and stress, your anxiety? Are you in a better mood? So you could look within person to see, for example, across the top, on days in which you're playing music, do you look better off than days that you don't? And you could look across time in terms of lagged effects. If you play music on one day, does that have an impact the next day? Or if you start out not in a good mood, and then are you more or less likely to play music? So you begin to look at some of the lagged and causal relationships. And we can also do it in terms of experience sample. If you do it more than one time on a day, you could vary. You could beat people or somehow remind them to respond to your questionnaire, or every time they're playing music, they respond and tell you, or you take measurements of their blood pressure, etc. So as we're doing this research, not only do we ask different questions, but the kind of design also has to be tied to what kind of outcomes we have. Are they momentary outcomes, more fluctuating outcomes, or are they more general, long-term kinds of outcomes? And that will have a big impact on the kind of design that you use. We could look at physical health, psychological well-being, cognition, memory, longevity, social engagement, sensory abilities, just to name a few. And again, depending on the kind of outcome, your design may have to be much more specific and much more fluctuating in terms of looking over short periods of time versus long periods of time. So let me wrap up by talking about possible prospect and promise of work on art. So many of the studies today talked about learning something new. So learning taking people who really are naive in theater or whatever it might be. And here we can really talk about the effects of learning something new on plasticity, neuroplasticity, for example, or a sense of mastery or enjoyment, starting out by not having prior experience with this. By the same token, some of the other presentations today focused on lifelong engagement and the long-term benefits of art. And here we have to think about adaptation and aging. Many of the studies that we have looked at in the literature on cognitive aging suggest that it's really doing something new that's very beneficial to you. Denise Park's work, for example. But here we also have evidence that's doing the same thing over a long period of time can be beneficial. So it's an interesting juxtaposition here. But I think when we're looking at long-term engagement, we can't assume that just because we start arts at an early time in life that we won't have to make adjustments and adaptation and be flexible. And art may allow us to be flexible. One of my favorite examples comes from the selective optimization with compensation theory. And Baltus gave the wonderful example of Arthur Rubinstein, who played music into his 90s. And he gave this example of how he had to adapt. Even though he played for so many years and was a wonderful pianist, he had to be selective. He couldn't play as many pieces as he did when he was younger. He had a more reduced repertoire. He used optimization. He had to practice more often than he did when he was younger. And an example of compensation, maintaining goals in the face of losses. In this case, he gave the example of slowing down. We all know with aging people slow down. And in order for him to give the illusion that he was playing something quickly, he would slow down his playing right before the piece that was supposed to be fast. So it gave the sense that he really was playing quickly, but it was this illusion of slowing down. A wonderful example of compensation. So in conclusion, I think there is so much promise for looking at art and its impact on aging and really lifespan development. We can think about prevention to optimize lifespan development, remediation. There were examples today about using art for dementia, Parkinson's disease as examples, quality of life and health. I have looked at a number of different ads for senior housing, whether CCRCs, long-term care, some of the places that actually Victor has been to. Here's one example, so much more than a place to live, and what do they use to illustrate that? A woman painting. Many of these housing places use art as one of the selling points. It's something that attracts people. But we know it's not necessarily evidence-based. And then the question is, well, does it need to be or not? They're getting people to come. People are participating in these arts. Does it really matter? I have talked to many directors and program directors at these facilities, and they're not necessarily interested in finding out what the research says about it. They know it's working, and they don't necessarily want to do this evidence-based work. So that's a whole other set of issues, I think, that we need to take into account. That we can do translational research, and it may be something important, but it's already something that's going on at a widespread basis. And just to make a plug for training in lifespan development and aging, many people talk today about getting together scientists and artists. And I think this is an incredibly wonderful idea. And as much as we'd like to hear more about art, I hope that artists are more interested in learning about development and aging, and then they can realize the tremendous potential and application of their skills and their trade to understanding and helping to optimize development across the lifespan. Thank you.
And for someone who needs no introduction, Art Kramer.
I don't have any slides for two reasons. One reason is it forces me to listen because my hobby is mind wandering, and I can't mind wander when I have to listen. And two, I've been reading the biography of Steve Jobs. Maybe some of you have, and there was a quote in there that I figured is a good statement when I don't put a presentation together, and that is, if you know what you're talking about, you don't need PowerPoint. That's Steve Jobs. I think he didn't like competitors like Bill Gates either, but I'm not sure what the motivation is. But I have a few points to make, and I think they'll be complementary rather than overlapping with what Margie said. First, we all got smarter today. Those of us who are still here got a lot smarter than those who left earlier, because we got a good deal of mental, emotional, and a little bit of physical. We had to walk up to the third floor, but other than that, not much physical exercise. And we know stimulation is really quite good for our minds and brains. Second, I think today we heard a lot of sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit statements about the importance of inter and multidisciplinary teams. I think we can't just be artists, or we can't just be cognitive scientists or biologists or neuroscientists and do these studies well. In fact, I think it goes way beyond the kinds of teams that I've put together, which are pretty broad. I think even if we're basic researchers, we need to think about the future and maybe incorporate public health folks and health economists and, of course, animal models, perhaps in parallel with the human models, and some computational models that have plausibility with respect to neural function and computation. And we definitely need enlightened architects like Victor to help us think about these things. And I think of the Beckman Institute, which won the Science Building of the Year when it opened in 1989. It was a place designed to encourage interaction. And, I'm one of the bad guys now because I'm administration as well as faculty, so I need to worry about actually funding the place, which costs quite a bit of money every year to fund. And I'm really not supposed to lose money in any of the operations, but I do, and I'd be happy to. We have a cafeteria that has generated so many studies when a theoretical physicist sits down with a neuroscientist and a dancer and all kinds of combinations. We have scientists and humanists from 44 different departments in 8 colleges. And designing the building to encourage interaction was extremely important. And unfortunately for all of us, it was well designed. Another point is that I think we pretty much ignored Eastern approaches to the arts today. And I know there's some of that in the papers, but those of you who came today and didn't read the papers couldn't really, or you can get that, but perhaps later. And I don't think it's East versus West. I think it's East plus West. And if you're interested in reading a little bit about this, I'd suggest a TICS review, that's Trends in Cognitive Science, by Yiwan Tang, a Chinese physician, and Mike Posner. And if you know anything about cognitive science, you know that name, Mike Posner. He's an old guy with a lot of creative and crazy ideas. And the two of them work together to study both what they call attention state training, changing state using something called integrated body-mind therapy, which is a combination of meditation and mindfulness training with a little Tai Chi mixed in, and attention training, which Mike has made his career about. So it's the Western and Eastern approaches integrated, and it's really beautiful and crazy work, and it's something you do at the end of your career when you don't really care what people think about what you do. And I think it's just great stuff. I think we've heard before that aging starts at birth or perhaps before, and we really shouldn't start studying aging when people are 65. I think there are a lot of interesting questions we can address if we take a lifespan position, such as when to begin with interventions, duration, intensity, starting and stopping. Nina said she was interested in that, as am I. I think in terms of physical activity, I'm convinced the no free lunch hypothesis is true. That is, stop it, and the benefits go away pretty quickly with some exceptions. And I bet this is true. There might be some long-term benefits, but they might be a bit larger if you continue. I think another way to think about the kinds of studies we do, and I think Nita illustrated this very well with her studies today, is one interesting approach is the approach to match the art form to the kinds of changes that we see, and often the negative changes we see in the context of aging, as a way to enhance perhaps auditory sensory function, auditory recognition, and perhaps auditory recall. And I think what we could do is almost map out the relationship to the extent that's possible between art forms, between changes we want to remediate or improve, and outcome measures. And outcome measures are critical also, and we've talked a little bit about this. Some of them are appropriate for the lab. fMRI is a good example. Those magnets are really heavy, and to bring them out into the community would be hard, although some of them exist on flatbed trailers for hospitals. And some of the measures are very easy to bring out, such as the autobiographical or perhaps the diary, and even some of our computer-based measures. There are a number of batteries now that exist on iPads and phones, Androids and iPhones. In fact, some of them you can download from the iTunes store, and I'd be happy to point you in that direction. I make no money on any of this, but I do collaborate with gamers. I think also the studies of clinical populations. We talked a little bit about Alzheimer's, dementia, and Jolene made the point that we often don't make the distinctions. It's not clear between Lewy body dementia or vascular or Alzheimer's. And I think we can actually learn a lot about examining the efficacy and mechanisms of these interventions with different populations. For example, something that I recently learned from Henrietta von Prague that lives close to here, she works at NIH, and that is, although exercise seems to benefit many, many different aspects of populations, from AD patients and Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis and normal elderly and 7-year-old kids, it shows negative effects, that is, costs, with Huntington animals that are created, they're knockouts and transgenes. And why is that? And can that be informative with respect to mechanism? I bet it can. And then finally, the issue of nature, and I thought that was missing, and then it came in from Kathy's presentation. And there really has been a resurgence in the study of nature, which can be an art form or just what we experience. Doesn't always have to be an art form, but can be. In this study, I didn't know about the biophilia theory. I knew about Wilson, but I didn't know about his theory. There's a new theory, and I can't forget the name. Even when I'm demented, I'll know what it is. It's art, attention, restoration theory. And this is a theory by a fellow by the name of Kaplan out of the University of Michigan. And some of these more recent studies have focused on cognitive and brain changes to go along with stress reduction and other kinds of changes we've seen. And one interesting issue is how we put these different interventions together, whether they're physical or social or art or exposure to nature, to augment, to essentially create synergies between these different interventions. Do we get more bang for our buck if we eat right and exercise than if we only do one of the two? Do we get more bang for our buck if we socialize and exercise? Well, I use these two examples because they're animal studies on both of them, and the answer is yes, sometimes additive, sometimes multiplicative effects. To do these kinds of studies, it would be nice to understand the underlying mechanisms, but I'm not sure we need to wait from a public health perspective to look at these multimodal interventions that we can create by putting together art forms and exercise. I was interviewed a number of years ago, and somebody said, what's the best intervention you can imagine? And I said, well, it doesn't exist yet, but it's a walking book group. And, you read the book, you take a walk with friends, and you bring that remember the Boda from, I think that's what it's called, from the 1960s? Because you'd want to drink wine, good red wine, high in antioxidants. So, you have the good diet, you have social interaction, intellectual stimulation, and a little exercise simultaneously. No, I don't know that anybody's looked at it, but I think it's worth looking at. That's what I have to say. Thanks.
Final speaker will be Becca. Levy. Want to go up to the podium? Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to provide you some of the things that jumped out at me as being really exciting. And thank you for the sponsors for making this possible, and Nancy for all that you've done to make this possible, and all the participants, particularly those who wrote the commission papers, because they've been very helpful to give me an overview of the field. So just my overall impression from reading the commission papers and from today is that I think the research findings are very promising. And I think there are some really outstanding examples of research that were presented today. So the research that the Noises have been doing, and then most recent research with Art Kramer, and then some of the qualitative work I think is really outstanding. So the work that Ann Bastine and Kate have been doing, I think, are some great examples. But as we've talked about, there's also some evidence that the field could be strengthened. And I want to talk about 4 opportunities that jumped out at me as things to think about to go forward. So the first is the opportunity to encourage research that builds on theories, and that's something that Jelaine mentioned in her paper, in her presentation, and just the idea that if we have a theory that we can build on and models we can test, that maybe ideas will come together a little bit more. And so the first example of a theory that I thought it may have some applicability is Dean Simonson's model of creative careers. And what's exciting about some of his work is he has some really testable hypotheses. So, for example, one of the things he talks about is that domain really matters, and that's something that's come up today, is whether we can put the domains together for a multimodal approach, or whether we should keep on comparing different domains of creativity. And the other thought that he presents in his model is that it's good to change creative outlets over time. And so, for example, Grandma Moses, she switched from embroidery. Her hands, she got some arthritis, and she couldn't use a needle anymore, so she switched to painting at 76 and suddenly became very prolific and popular. So that's a nice example of that. I also wanted to mention a theory that I've been thinking about, which is stereotype embodiment theory. And it's the idea that we have these age stereotypes or beliefs about aging that exist in our culture. And we can take them in at a very young age, starting at about 3 or 4. We have evidence that children already have them. And these can lead to self-definitions, which can have influence in functioning and health in later life. And I think that some of these stereotypes that are really popular in our culture have applicability to creativity and older artists. So, for example, a very popular stereotype is that old age is a time of decline, cognitively and physically. Also, there's another positive age stereotype on the other side, that old age is a time of creativity. And so I think that it's good to think about how those stereotypes may inform the experience of being an artist, but also how art can potentially change those stereotypes, I think is an exciting thing to think about. And I thought I would just present one quick piece of evidence that we have gathered from an ongoing National Institute of Aging funded study. And so I've been collaborating with people at Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging. And this shows a study that we found that age stereotypes that are expressed before the age of 30 can have an impact on cardiovascular events after the age of 60. So the blue line are those who express more negative age stereotypes at baseline. And as you can see, they have twice the risk of having a cardiovascular event after the age of 60. And we find that after we adjust for a number of factors as well. So the second opportunity I wanted to mention is to look at ways to make art interventions most effective, and a number of these we've talked about throughout the day. One is the idea of passive versus active art forms, and I think actually after the last presentation about architecture, I'm thinking that maybe passive isn't quite the right term. As you said, if it's on night duty, it's maybe something that's much more dynamic than I was thinking about before. So just the whole idea of how engaged we are, I think is really important. And then this topic has come up a couple of times, the idea of whether we choose the art form or we're randomly assigned. The Noises have found that I guess randomly assigned can still be effective. And also the role of cultural art has come up. I know Art just mentioned that, but I think there's the idea that we want to include more ethnic minorities, but also we want to think about the role of ethnic or culturally specific art. And I don't think we know yet whether there's more benefit from having a congruence of cultural specific art, or whether it's better to have kind of be exposed to novel cultures. And so that's something that I think we could test. The third opportunity is to develop rigorous designs. I won't spend much time on this because it's been covered. The only thing that I think maybe hasn't been covered is just the idea that art itself is perhaps operating on some level on an unconscious processing mode. And so it would be nice to think about how we get at that. What are those measures that get at unconscious thinking? And there's been some great advances in measuring unconscious thinking. So maybe some of those could be incorporated in some of our research. And so the last opportunity I wanted to mention is the idea of identifying mechanisms that art promotes health. So the first I think is something that I think is really exciting is the neurocognitive plasticity that we've talked a bit about today. So Gottfried Schlaug's work and then Nina Krause's work, which was featured in the New York Times this week. And so that's very exciting to think about some of those changes that are happening in our brain. And then another level that I think is really interesting to think about is the idea of art as an opportunity for reminiscence and making meaning as we approach death. So there may be some specific things that are happening with older adults that are not happening as much at other stages of the lifespan that are important to think about. And I thought I would give one quick example of an artist or writer who maybe exemplifies this last idea. So Henry Roth, the prolific, at least at the end of his life, and well-known American writer. So he wrote his first novel at the age of 28, and then for the next 45 years had writer's block. And then between age 73 and 89, he had this surge of creativity, and he wrote 6 autobiographical novels. And so he argued that that surge in later life was due to him, as he approached death, it really inspired him to think back on his life, and it allowed him to come to terms with actions that he regretted and allowed him to come to terms with his own mortality. And just a quote from one of his later autobiographical works from an older protagonist who is writing about the process of writing. He writes, "Writing is a window into my remaining future. It is my survival and a penance." And the last thing that I wanted to mention is this documentary, which you probably are already aware of, but I actually just heard about it very recently. Actually, my dad read something about it and told me about it when he heard about this conference. And so this is this documentary called I Remember Better When I Paint, which fits in very well with the early session that we had on the role of art in dementia. But I actually just received it by mail just before I came here, so I watched it on the train coming here. And I was delighted to see that Robert Butler is featured prominently in it. And I know he's near and dear to many of the people in this room, and he's one of my favorite people, so I thought I would end just with his observations about the field, which I think if he was alive, I'm sure he would be here and would be very excited about the direction of this workshop. So he talks about how baby boomers need to overcome their denial of aging and be their own advocates for developing new ways to prevent Alzheimer's disease and improve quality of life of those with Alzheimer's disease. And he also talks about how arts can be mobilized as a key resource to give individuals purpose. And although the research that he talks about isn't about purpose specifically in art, although I think that's something that we can look at, but he cites research that looks at purpose as contributing to improving health and longevity. I just wanted to acknowledge my collaborators, Luigi Frucci, Martin Slade, and Alan Zonderman on the one figure that I showed, and Donahue Foundation, NIA, and NHLBI on our research. I thought I would end with an image of Grandma Moses. Thank you.
Well, this is, thank you all panelists. This is almost the moment you've been waiting for. This is what we call in the business open mic. So at this point, we would like to actually solicit comments from people in the audience about what they heard today, questions that could be raised to any of the speakers who are still here, or just things that you want to get off your chest. And if it gets too long, I'll cut you off. But it's a time for really to feedback to the group, and then I'll have some summary comments at the end. So if you want to raise your hand or go to the mics up, yeah.
Art Kramer just mentioned the use of animal models, and Nina mentioned them earlier this morning, and certainly I think animal models will be useful to get at mechanisms of, I don't know, neural mechanisms underlying, say, response to sound or learning or something like that. But my question is are the arts a uniquely human phenomenon, or is there something equivalent in non-human organisms?
I'm not sure specifically about the arts, but to echo what Nina talked about this morning, and I agree completely, without our facilities, our perceptual, our cognitive, our motor facilities, it would be tough to appreciate and engage in art. So I think to the extent we can understand memory, sensory function, perception, and action, which we can most certainly understand from animal models, I don't know. Animals are certainly creative. You've all seen the monkey videos with the monkey getting the insects out of the hole with a stick and so forth. Whether they create art, I think Coco created art. Mm-hmm. I think the great apes can be taught to create art, but whether they naturally do it, I don't know. but I'm not sure they have to garner benefit from animal models. I think perhaps the easiest lifestyle choice to scale up from animal to human models is physical activity, running wheel, treadmill. It works, and that's how we know so much about the molecular and cellular mechanisms. But despite the maybe mismatch between art and what animals do, I think the basic processes are going to be important to the extent we understand them.
Yes, at the back.
Well, when you said open mic, the first thing that came into my mind was that neuropsychologist, an artist, and a biostatistician walk into a bar. And it got onto my chest, and I just had to get it out. But seriously, folks, I'm here all week. I really appreciated, Margie, your discussion once you got past the RCTs and really presented all non-RCT designs as equal. And I think that's a really we certainly, some of us at NIH have been talking about how do we promote non-RCT research, and given that we are all working on a new interdisciplinary collaboration, how do you folks think that we could foster that collaboration and equalize designs as we go forward together? That's for all of you.
Okay, well, I think my main point is that it really depends on the question. And so not all questions are necessarily answered by RCT design. And so I think that's really the point, is I think in part you can develop questions related to methods and you can develop methods related to questions. But I think the main thing is to develop the question and then to talk to people who are familiar with lots of different kinds of methods to see if they're, and in the end, it's not just one design. Typically, to answer the questions well, you've got to do multiple kinds of designs. But I do think that RCT is not the only one, and so I think that's all I would say at this point.
Hi, my name is Raquel Stevenson. I'm a visual art therapist, and I've really appreciated listening to the many perspectives today, and I know from my own experience as an art therapist working with older adults who are both healthy and those with dementia, and through my own research, a lot of these points about the challenges of research and connecting it with human developmental aspects, and certainly the value of visual arts, creative arts therapies, creative arts in general are obvious. But I guess my question is, a lot of people I've met today are doing some really wonderful research, but how do practitioners connect up with researchers? I think that that's a big question for me, is how can we get the people who are actually on the ground doing this wonderful work and know for a fact that this is working? How do we connect it up with empirical researchers and the funders to get, some of these things we've talked about today actually moving?
If in fact, you have groups of people who can be studied, and you have programs where people can come on in and apply standardized or individualized, tailored to your program, rigorous scientific methods to get outcomes. I'm
wondering if there's just some sort of facility or facilitation between arts therapies, artists, practicing artists who are running these groups already with some of the research who might be involved or already are involved. How can we connect the people together? I guess that's my kind of a practical question.
I think one way to do it perhaps is that a number of us are media hams, and we like to talk to the media. And I think we're also pretty friendly. So send us an email, give us a call. I think many of us also like to do public presentations, and I did one two nights ago. And it was pretty interesting because I had a number of interesting characters come up to me. One of them I knew in the theater department at the University of Illinois happens to be the go-to guy when any actor wants to learn how to fence. For example, he taught Johnny Depp how to fence. And he said to me, I'm really interested in what you're doing. Could we sit and talk? And I said, let's go out to lunch. So you never know what's going to happen, but send us an email. Nina's easily accessible. She was just in the New York Times. You can find her.
I think there's, in addition, there's a whole area that we didn't talk about today, and that's the idea of dissemination or diffusion research, and that there just wasn't time on the agenda. But in fact, there are ways of getting things out there, and but it is a whole other Pandora's box that we just didn't get to today.
So I'm Liz Nielsen from the National Institute on Aging, and actually I was going to address the question that was just asked a little bit, talking about some funding opportunities that are out there already that are really ripe for this group to exploit. We have an existing program announcement that seeks to pair researchers with community organizations. Julian Johnson has a grant from the NIA on that theme. And I think the challenge really is making the connection. So we don't have a facility for making those connections. Really, it has to go both ways. But being exposed to these kinds of networks is important. At the same time, my colleagues Bill Elwood and Deb Olster and others in the room are members of a large NIH-wide basic behavioral and social sciences network called OpNet that has 2 funding announcements out right now. One is on multisensory processing, and looks at sort of processing across modalities, which was a theme that came up here. And I think one of the key things, while we focus on basic behavioral and social sciences research in OpNet, we are interested in exploring basic processes within the context of interventions. And so there may be opportunities for leveraging that RFA for some of the research people are engaged in now. And then Bill has led an initiative on culture, health, and well-being, which is really about forging networks to help develop science in very interdisciplinary areas. So the NIH has a number of mechanisms that can promote science in these areas. Some of them may already be on the books, and I see Bill probably wants to comment a bit on the culture one. But I think investigator-initiated ideas are very welcome in this area without very specific announcements. But I wanted people to be aware of those opportunities.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. In fact, I was very happy to see early on in the day that the 20 copies of the Basic Social and Behavioral Research on Culture RFA flew off the table. So this is a one-time offer. All the operators will stand by until the middle of December to receive your applications. And what is so exciting about this, not just for practicality, is that it is about bringing people together who never may have had an opportunity before to work together. That could actually include art therapists as well as transdisciplinary people. And the RFA expressly includes language that arts and humanities disciplines are welcome, so long as arts and humanities do not exceed, since the focus is on basic social and behavioral research, arts and humanities need to be like 49% or less. Thank you, Jonathan. If you've never applied for federal grants before, you may want to start there early at grants.gov to register yourself and your institution with their Dun & Bradstreet number, and you'll end up also creating yourself an NIH profile so you can follow your application through the entire submission and review process and get your summary statement, which I certainly hope would have a fundable score for you.
Yes.
David, I didn't mean to jump the queue, but I couldn't help but say also that if, as part of this whole federal task force initiative on the arts and human development, we're very much interested in those kinds of announcements and promoting them to a broader community. So people can email fedtaskforce@arts.gov to learn about such things as we learn about them and make them available at the federal government. One thing that Julene said yesterday, though, I think is really important in our closed meeting, kind of about communication between these different parties. I think you said this about the need to find better ways to get these people talking to each other in the language that they can understand. And whether that means including, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but bringing in statisticians, methodologists. I think you said some of this actually in your presentation, on the research team so that they can mediate between these different parties.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, I'm Terrell. I'm a music therapist. And I was curious, since we're talking about sort of expansion of services or greater integration of the arts into pre-existing programming, if any of the members of the task force or anyone else might know of any initiatives that are going to be implemented through the healthcare reform with regard to looking at evidence-based practice or evidence bases for the types of programming that we're talking about today.
Jonathan, you want to address that?
Generally, you can't talk about funding opportunities that aren't announced yet. But in addition to anything that may be coming out of NIH, I should point out that because very few people know about it at the moment, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, I don't know if they have anything in the pipeline at all related to this, but PCORI, as it's known here in DC, because, has actually been rolling out funding opportunity announcements, some of which may or may not be, have a component there that would be handy. And I only mention it because nobody knows to look. And it is, unfortunately, yet another different grant submission system. So you can check on their website to find out what you'd have to do to get ready for that.
Right here.
This is a question for Art. Gene Cohn had this idea of the arts were for older people, like chocolate for the brain. He theorized that the two spheres communicated more as people aged. And I guess the term is asymmetry. And is there any, that's a pleasurable feeling, and that older people experience that more. Is there any research that backs that up?
Well, kind of. I would suggest you take a look at some of Laura Carstenson's research and others, but what Laura looks at is the change in the balance between maybe intellectually and occupationally driven kinds of pursuits that we do when we're younger and building our career, and more importance placed on emotion and other kinds of factors as we get older. In fact, it's interesting. It's not always, we talked about closeness to death being important in the way you behave, and there have been a few studies done that suggest that's true. We change our preferences and we change the way we behave, but it's not just due to aging, because there are some studies done where people had chronic conditions, they might have been younger, they were closer to death, and they changed to a more emotional, social lifestyle, and then they recovered, and then they went back to their old style. So it's not just aging, it's closeness to death seems to have implications. But I'd say look at Laura's research, look at some of Margie's research. There are a number of people that bring the psychosocial to the cognitive to the emotional. So there is research on the topic.
Anyone else? Up.
Daniel Potts again from Alabama. I just wanted to say thank you. This has been a wonderful conference. And I also wanted to make a point that those of us who have walked the road as a caregiver with an individual who is expressing, like we've been talking about, there's a spiritual aspect also that comes to play as well. And I think we're riding a very exciting cusp here between art, science, and the spiritual. And so some folks in those fields probably would be interested as well in contributing to some of the research. Thank you.
Let me say a few summary comments. We've covered a lot of territory today. We heard about mechanisms early on. We heard a lot of different participants, ranging from people who have specific diseases such as dementia, Alzheimer's disease, to people who are healthier. We heard a lot about interventions. We heard about interventions that ranged all the way from very active improvisational types of things to choral, to group types of things, to more passive types of interventions, and even aesthetic design, what something looks like as being an intervention. Things that still need to be clarified. There's some soft spots about the what and what type of intervention might work best, or how different things compare for different populations. The doses, how much do you really need? The settings they're best offered in. Becca gave Margie gave just a wonderful review on design there, and what the kinds of design issues that need to be considered. Outcomes, not only health outcomes, but cost outcomes and cost effectiveness types of outcomes and cost benefit outcomes. We talked about the barriers. Some of the things that didn't come up so much today, but certainly came up some in the papers and in other literature about technology. The technology that is out there and the technology that is waiting to be developed. Much of the research is based on technology that didn't have technology that's available today and that won't be available tomorrow, and how technology can help both in the implementation of the arts, but also in the evaluation of programs and their effectiveness. Other barriers included the paucity of the workforce in terms of the researchers who are actually going into this kind of research and ways to fund them. Also mentioned was the crosstalk between different kinds of disciplines, those who are the content experts and those who are the research experts. We didn't talk a whole lot about scalability and fidelity, but what we're seeing mostly in the research that was presented today are relatively small studies that if you're going to bring them out to the community or really generalize them, what it would take to bring them up to scale and to make sure that they were faithful to the original effective intervention. And finally, cost effectiveness. That the whole idea of being beneficial and whether it's worthwhile to implement these. And as someone mentioned, that there were a lot of programs that were implemented that didn't have any evidence behind them, and they kind of went by the wayside. So in closing, I'd like to just say a couple of things. One is that art is, as a route to successful aging, is a lot like life. It's complicated and messy. And what I'd like to encourage those, particularly those who are the sponsors of research, and those also who are conducting the research, is don't run away from the messy. It's really easy to do easy incremental types of differences. When I first went into research, I sat across the table from a woman who was the project officer for a foundation. She'd been getting grants for decades and decades and decades, and she was giving me, a young researcher, some advice. She says, there's two kinds of people who knock on my door. There are people who are very senior researchers who have long track records of great research, and they want to study something that's a tiny incremental gain here. And you have tremendous amount of confidence that they'll get it done. And then there are people who come in with fantastic ideas, and you have absolutely no confidence whatsoever they will get it done. And so we all kind of want to be somewhere in between those. We want to take some risks. We want to do the stuff that was presented today, and the stuff that the people in this room are thinking about or want to do next should be risky. It should be risky. Otherwise, we're not going to move this field forward. And I encourage, although it's not within the funders' mechanisms to do this without going through the peer review process, but we as peer reviewers also have to be willing to take risk a little bit. And study sections are like the most conservative people in the entire world. So the idea is to really try to make those quantum leaps, because if we're incremental, we will be left behind, and certainly by the time that I really need this kind of aging stuff. So in conclusion, I'd like to make some thank yous. First, Nancy Kirkendall, who was just wonderful to work with as the administrative lead here, and to Connie Citro from the National Academies of Science, Committee on National Statistics. Special thanks to Agnes Gaskin, who did all the detail work, and it was orchestrated perfectly. To the steering committee members, Sandra Crew, Art Kramer, Nina Kraus, Becky Levy, and Helga Noyce. Let me just say, this was a dream team from my perspective. Everybody delivered. Everybody delivered on time, and the products were really great. It was just a pleasure. Believe it or not, we never met each other in person until yesterday, and all this was done by conference calls and people doing their jobs. Also to the sponsors, all the N's, NIA, NEA, NCAM, and OBSSR, which could be considered NIH. And finally, to all the speakers who were stayed on time and gave very complimentary and telling talks, and the audience. The audience was great. So thank you, safe travels, and be well.